Hi, good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay,
Good morning.
Yes, I
wonderful.
can.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to YACWA's Youth Workers Unite session. We have a pretty exciting session today. It's our 7th in our series. And today's focus is on the unique mental health impacts of COVID-19 on LGBTQIA plus young people, as well as an overview of how to provide some postventative and preventative supports for them at this time. Before we begin, I'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians and caretakers of country. For me, this is the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, but this is a statewide call, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of all nations represented here today across Western Australia. And I think that this is particularly important in the wake of the Saturday's rally for the Indigenous Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement, which is seeing some global support at the moment. There's a lot we need to do in Western Australia in order to achieve true equality and reconciliation. And YACWA stands firmly in support of the movement and is committed to making sure that the rally on Saturday is continued into meaningful change in closing the gap and empowering particularly Aboriginal young people who often are left without a voice. With that said, we have a very busy session today, and welcome to our 7th Youth Workers Unite workshop. I'd like to thank the Department of Finance for their grant, which has supported us to provide some professional development and continue to host these spaces for the youth sector. During COVID-19 and our recovery, we know that there are a lot of emerging needs and unusual issues that have never really been canvassed before in terms of unaddressed trauma and social isolation across the community. And it's really important that we were able to have this space and provide a little bit of extra support for the sector in order to respond to emerging need. Before we begin, just a couple of quick rules of engagement. Everybody, please make sure that your microphone is on mute unless you're speaking, just to minimize some background noise, as it helps keep things moving quite smoothly. That's not to say don't speak up, but when you do, please make sure you unmute then. We don't do an attendee readout just to save some time. So when you do speak, please introduce your name and organisation. You could alternatively change your name in Zoom to reflect your organisation, just to provide people a bit of context as to who's on the call and where you're speaking from. You can participate via the chat function as well in the bottom right-hand corner, which will be monitored by myself, Stefan and Matthew from YACWA. We'll also try to put in any links that are mentioned verbally just to make sure that you have a bit more information at your disposal. And anything put into the chat, particularly if it's a resource or a question, will be included in the minutes following the meeting. So just because it's not said verbally doesn't mean it's not captured. We're listening to every contribution here. With that said, we'll move on to Bella Broadway's workshop. We have Bella here today from Connection and Wellbeing Australia, providing about an hour-and-a-half long workshop on LGBTQI plus mental health. Bella, would you like to take us away?
I would. Kaya, everyone. My name's Bella. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm just going to put a little disclaimer out there that I'm incredibly clunky. I'm going to be switching between PowerPoints and surveys and all kinds of things. So stick with me. We'll get there in the end. And as Mason said, there'll be lots of ways for you to contribute. So please do so throughout the workshop. With that, I am going to attempt to share my screen. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully you can see what I see very shortly. So I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the different lands that we're meeting on, of the many nations, of their elders, ancestors and leaders. And as Mason said, particularly articulate my solidarity for First Nations folks in this country, knowing that we stand with them to work towards true equality for them and their people. So I'm going to get you to do a little bit of work just so we can kind of get to know each other, because I'm a more sort of in-person kind of person. So with a virtual environment, I just want us to try and find a way to kind of connect with each other and our shared experiences of knowledge of this topic. So if you're either on your computer or your phone, if you could just go to menti.com and pop in this little code. You'll get about half a dozen questions come up. With the questions, sometimes you need to press submit or next to move on to the first question. If you've been able to get on to Menti by now, you'll see that the first question is kitten related, which is a little bit off topic, but it's just a chance to kind of use the platform and make sure it's working. I'll give you all a few moments to kind of go through those questions. That link will be live the whole time. And the very last question gives you the opportunity to ask questions that maybe you might not feel comfortable putting in the chat function, because any data that's put into Menti is randomized and anonymous, so it won't say who asked the question, but hoping that you feel confident and to ask questions just through the chat, or if you'd like to speak as well. Let me know if you have any problems with that, but feel free to just kind of get to it while I just sort of do the first few intro slides. So as Mason said, we work a lot around suicide prevention, suicide awareness and suicide intervention training. We work a lot with lived experience, mental health and wellbeing, family and domestic violence, and we do a lot of work in the space of inclusivity and diversity. And you might not think that that's actually working within mental health and suicide prevention, but we know that learning how to better support specific communities can really affect how and if and where they access help seeking, and also the types of supports that they're provided to provide them with better mental health and wellbeing outcomes. I just want to also acknowledge our LGBTIQ+ community leaders, and I think that that's really important, because even a few short years ago, having a session like this with this kind of topic might have been funded by something like the Department of Finance. So it's really important that we understand that the activism, visibility, and the work that's been done in this space for a number of years has led to us to where we are now, where we can have open dialogue about how we can better support all members of our community, and in this case, specifically LGBTIQ+ folks. So I just wanted to throw out a few group guidelines, just making sure that we're respecting that there's different levels of knowledge and experience in the room around this topic. Because we don't have structured learning about sex, sexuality and gender diversity in our education system, sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and we might come to a topic like this with a lot of information, or maybe only a little bit, or maybe information that wasn't exactly as correct as we thought it first was. So really just acknowledging that for some of you, I might be throwing out a bit of content there that you're like, yes, I know, hurry up. But remembering that not everybody might have had that kind of structured learning about this topic. So just sitting with that and acknowledging that. Confidentiality. Sometimes people come, when they're seeing across the content, they're thinking of a particular young person they might be working with, and they want to ask a question around how to best support that young person. Just really being mindful that we're not sharing any details that could identify that young person, because Perth is a very small space and Perth youth work is a very small space as well. So just really being mindful of that as we can. Also just wanting to create an assumption-free zone. And what I mean by that is really challenging ourselves when we're talking about this topic to not try and present the information as if we're othering someone. So that's kind of like using language like all bisexuals do this, all gay men do this. Because when we're doing that, we're assuming that all people that identify that way are the same, which we know is not the case. But we're also assuming that there aren't people here with us today in this session that don't identify in that way. So really trying to stretch ourselves to not do that if we can. Which brings me to general language and discussion. We know that language is one of the biggest barriers to being able to support young people around LGBTIQ+ topics. And we really want you to ask questions using the language that you have. If there's better language that we can provide you with, we'll do that. But we don't want language to be a barrier to asking any questions. And if you do have questions, get them out there, because I guarantee there's 10 other people sitting behind their computer going, yes, thank you for asking that, Mason. Yes, thank you, Trisha. I really appreciate you said that, because I was really wondering about that. So please really get those questions out there. So we might have a little look at our group and see where we're at. So looking at Menti, now controversially, we have 17% of people that aren't into kittens, which we could do a whole workshop about, but I'm not going to focus on that right now because this is an assumption and judgment-free zone, and we love those people who don't like kittens, even if we don't understand them. Looking at what we do, so lots of youth work to be expected. We're counsellors, we work in sexology, we simply do gay stuff. We do placemaking, policy, sexual health, sports coach, a really rich experience of different types of roles that we hold. And I also find it's interesting that not very often do people put content in this question that's around their personal lives. And I think that it's really important when we look at this content to think about it with our youth worker hat on, or our coach hat on, or our mental health worker hat on, but also our community hat on, our humanity hat on, and know that thinking about how we move about the world and how we interact with LGBTIQ plus people in our personal lives and how that might affect their mental health and wellbeing is something that's really important to do. So how confident are we? We're somewhat confident. Some people aren't sure, some people not so confident, but none of us are not confident at all. So I might be preaching to the choir a little bit with this first lot of information that I'm presenting, but I'm really just wanting to have that touchstone so we're all starting from the same place at the same time. Thinking about our biggest fears about supporting LGBTIQ plus young people, thinking about, okay, the difficulties in our regions, not having that organised body, that structure of support that can filter and drive action and provide support, unsure of how to engage, what's appropriate, knowledge and experience. We're thinking of organisational barriers. Lots of content here around not wanting, fear around saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, not knowing how to do something. And we know that often that stops conversations that could lead to really meaningful disclosures and being able to connect young people to support. So we're thinking about how some of this content we talk about today can drive us past these fears of getting it wrong and saying it wrong to just doing the best we can with what we know in the moment to open up spaces to be safe for young people to talk about their sex, sexuality and gender identity. Unconscious bias is a great one. Language. So if some of these things are coming up as we're moving through content, feel free to bring them in because we really want to get them out there and think about ways that we can change our practices ever so slightly that can make a world of difference to LGBTIQ plus young people. So we're just going to go through some very quick definitions. Starting from the very start to try and make sure we're all on the same page. So we're thinking about biological sex, which is the presence or absence of a Y chromosome. We're thinking about the type of gonads, sex hormones, internal and external reproductive anatomy. And there's a myth that there is only male and female biological sex, but we know that across nature, across species and across time, intersex variation is incredibly common and much more common than we might think. Intersex variations is about as common as being redheaded, which often shocks people because we don't talk about the variations in our biological sex. So we think it's not that common, but I would challenge that most of us know someone with red hair, and it's likely that most of us know someone with intersex variation. Gender expression. So we're talking about the ways in which we express our gender identity, typically through our appearance, our dress, and people might embrace a range of masculine or feminine or androgynous, somewhere in the middle, or a combination of those types of gender expression. We bring this up because it's important for us to remember that gender expression does not dictate gender identity. Does that make sense? So moving on to gender identity, this is our personal conception, the way we see ourselves as being male or female, or neither, or both, or a combination, or somewhere in the middle. There's no one way to be transgender or gender diverse or to look. Not everyone will affirm or can affirm their gender with things like hormones and surgeries. And when it comes to gender identity and thinking about the work that you do, one of the best things that we can keep in the back of our mind is that the individual is the authority when it comes to gender identity. You should not assume someone's gender identity by their voice, by the way that they look, by what their name is. And also remembering that gender identity, like sexuality, can shift over time. So we're really focusing on meeting young people where they are in front of us right now, knowing that that might not be the same as it was the last time that we saw them. And then sexuality, so not just who you sleep with, but who you have feelings for, who you're physically and emotionally attracted to or not. And it's important for us to remember with sexuality in young people that sexual identity is not necessarily dictated by sexual behaviour. That especially with young people might be engaging in sexual behaviour that's different from their sexual identity, and that could be part of responding to internal or external pressures to be with a certain type of person. And we just want to quickly bring up the Q. So in the alphabet soup of LGBTIQA plus P, it's ever expanding alphabet, often people who aren't part of the community are quite concerned about using the term queer. It is seen as in-group language, and what I mean by that is I might feel okay to call myself queer, but someone who doesn't know me, I might not feel comfortable for them to use that term for me. But we do see, especially with young people, more and more young people adopting the identity label of queer. So it's important as youth workers that you get comfortable with that word, in knowing that we use terms that people use to identify themselves, how they feel comfortable being identified. And I think why young people in particular find this identity label helpful is because it can encapsulate parts of gender identity or sexual identity without having to explain either one. So people can find that helpful in terms of not going down into the specifics of their different facets of their identity. It can sometimes stand for questioning in that acronym, and that's important too, because for young people that might be questioning their gender or their sexuality, having that Q in queer spaces, in an LGBTIQ plus space, can help signal to them that this could be a peer space for them to help explore those questioning feelings. With First Nations and older populations, there is quite a lot of resistance to using the term queer. And within all age groups, some people really, really adore it and find it a very useful and helpful term. And some people are very anti using the term because of the historic context of it being used. And just want to quickly throw out there about intersectionality. So thinking that not only is each person's experience of sex, sexuality and gender identity very different from one person to the next, but it can be significantly affected by other aspects of their identity. So LGBTIQ plus young people that you support also might experience racism or language barriers or public perception or disability discrimination. So sex, sexuality and gender diversity for a young person might be at the very core of their being. It might be a really important part of how they see themselves and how they feel the world sees them. Or it could just be a by the way thing. And there could be other aspects of their identity that are more at their core, that are more pressing, that you'll need to be thinking about how you respond in inappropriate ways to help meet those other identities. And lastly, just thinking about coming out. Often we talk about coming out in our community like it's one big surprise, I'm this, and I have a party, here's a cake, woohoo! But coming out can be a continual, multiple daily time experience for LGBTIQ plus people. Thinking about the work that you do in supporting young people, I would say probably the most important thing about coming out for you to think about is that we know that the time between self-realization, when somebody might think, okay, this is an identity that is sitting right with me, and the 6 months before they tell someone that or talk to someone about that, we know is the biggest risk time for young LGBTIQ plus people to act on thoughts of suicide. And why that is because until they might have even realised that it's talking about them, young people have heard negative messages about being LGBTIQ plus from media, from leaders, from their family, from institutions, from all kinds of spaces, from peers. And those messages have become internalized before that young person might have even realized that it's talking about them. So when that self-realization happens, all of a sudden a young person can think, well, actually, this means all these things, all these negative things that I've heard for years. And this is me, and that's scary. So if you can reduce that time between somebody realizing an identity and being able to speak to someone who can challenge those misleading ideas about what that identity is, that can really reduce the risk of ill mental health and of suicide. So providing safe spaces for young people to talk about sex, sexuality and gender identity is overwhelmingly a suicide prevention and mental health prevention activity. So the coming out can be a daily thing, and it can be an exhaustion of constant assessment. So there's little micro decisions of, can I hold my partner's hand on the train? That's a form of coming out. Can I dress the way I want when I go to this family occasion? That's a type of coming out. And if I'm going to the chemist and the chemist says, oh, who is this for? I say it's for my partner. And they say, oh, what is he on any other medications? That's a constant assessment of, am I coming out there? Am I disclosing my sexuality? Do I have the energy to do that? Is it safe for me to do that? Is it something that I want to do in that moment? Coming out can be very different for trans and bi individuals. And it can also be really different for culturally and linguistically diverse folks, migrant and refugee folks. And there's often a concept in many cultures around calling in or coming in instead of coming out. Because it's a bit of a Western idea, this idea that coming out is the gold standard and everybody's going to have fantastic outcomes once they're out and they feel free. And that's not always the case in many different cultural contexts. So really kind of just being aware of that. Making sure that we don't accidentally out any of our clients or young folks that we're supporting. And sometimes we do that inadvertently by saying, oh, I'm seeing my young trans client today. And that person their identity might be trans and they're happy to be spoken about in that way, or they might just see themselves as a man, not as a trans man. So really being mindful about language around that. And also thinking about when you're supporting young folks around thinking about coming out, helping them ascertain things around safety, around timing. Maybe grandma's 90th birthday, not the best time to tell the whole extended family. And also around practicality, thinking about, well, is there a risk to relationships, to security, to safety? Do we need to be planning for other accommodation options or other supports just in case a consequence to coming out is something that affects the security and housing of that young person? Any questions at the moment? I'm mindful that I've just gone blah, 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 blah.
Susan's had a great question in the chat, Bella, around whether or not queer and LGBTQIA plus should not be treated as synonyms, things that are in common but still separate, as not everyone identifies with one or the other. Could you speak on that a little bit, Bella?
Yes, I could probably speak on that for the whole hour and a half. And the short answer is, with any letter in the alphabet soup, when we're talking about sex, sexuality, and gender diversity, we can give literal definitions of what that word means, but for individuals, sometimes that word means something totally different to the individual. So it's really individual-led language. And I know I'm very guilty of using queer as shorthand for the LGBTIQ plus community. And often one of the most common questions we get asked is, can you just have a snappier title? Like, that's so hard to say. Can you make it different? And it's like, in reality, that alphabet soup could be 600 different letters, and there's new identities and nuance of identity that are being learned and rediscovered each and every day. So the short answer is yes, it's not good to use it as shorthand. And that's often why I do use sex, sexuality, and gender identity. So it's talking about the biological bits, it's talking about sexuality, and then it's talking about one's concept of self with gender, if that makes sense. Any other questions before we move on? No. So we want to start to have a think about the general mental health of LGBTIQ plus people and the barriers faced in accessing services, because this helps provide us with a bit of context for where young LGBTIQ plus people might be starting and how the specific impacts of COVID might have amplified where young LGBTIQ plus people have already started, if that makes sense. So thinking about homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and intersexism, LGBTIQ plus people experience significantly higher rates of ill mental health, of suicide, of homelessness. And it's important that we remember that this is a result of discrimination. It's not as a result of being LGBTIQ plus. So thinking about the ways in which you can change your practices, the words that you use, how you can drive change in the organisations and programs that you deliver, will have direct links to improving mental health and health outcomes for all LGBTIQ plus people and their loved ones. So I'm going to throw some stats at you. So these are from the LGBTI Health Alliance, and you'll notice they don't use the Q on the acronym. And actually different states, on the eastern states, it's quite often GLBTI. So just another example of how that language is a slippery beast. So these stats are from the LGBTI Health Alliance 2020 snapshot document. And we know that compared to the general population in regards to attempting suicide, LGBTI people 16 to 27 are 5 times more likely than the general population. Transgender folks are nearly 11 times more likely. People with an intersex variation over 16 are nearly 6 times more likely. And then we know that for LGBTI young people, that those stats increase even more. So really elevated stats before there's been a pandemic. This is just the everyday reality of LGBTIQ plus community. So building a picture of what the need might be around suicide prevention there. In terms of anxiety, LGBT people age 16 and over are over 3.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety. And for transgender folks, we're thinking 10 to 13 times more likely. And it's important that we also acknowledge that statistics are statistics, right? So they're not always the most reliable of things, but when it comes to statistics and the mental health and wellbeing of the LGBTIQ plus community, we also know that it's likely that these numbers are extremely underrepresented. And that's because in our supports and services, we don't capture data about sex, sexuality and gender identity. So we're often just seeing the tip of the iceberg with these stats here. So really thinking about a background of high levels of anxiety within the LGBTIQ+ community. This statistic is probably one of the most important from that report, is that despite these elevated levels of mental health and suicide, 71% of LGBTIQ+ people aged 16 to 27 did not use a support service during their most recent mental health crisis. And I think that that's a pretty shocking statistic. I don't know if it shocks people, if that's something that you've seen before. And a lot of that is centered around barriers, whether they're real or imagined discrimination, whether it's assumed discrimination, but also the multiple types of barriers for LGBTIQ+ young people in accessing services. And again, remembering this is before COVID, there's already these types of barriers. So I just want to have a bit of a chat about what we think some of those barriers might be, because one of the first steps in being able to provide more access to supports and services is to actually acknowledge and identify the barriers that exist. So we've got lots of good stuff that you put in here, really being afraid that we will discriminate. And that's a really poignant sentence, because we know that LGBTIQ+ people engaging with services basically assume discrimination until proven otherwise. So that means as a youth worker, as a service provider, you kind of on the back foot here. So you have to do a lot of work in being able to signal that you are a safe space to have conversations about sex, sexuality and gender diversity, to really make a young person feel confident that this is a space that they can talk about those types of things. A lot of stuff around regional areas, definitely. And in acknowledging, especially with mental health and health, that there's a lack of just mainstream services, let alone having a layer of LGBTIQ+ informed and specific services in the regions, definitely. Fear of judgment's coming up a lot, past negative experiences, and that's often what informs the assumed discrimination in engaging with services, having had multiple prior experiences with the health and mental health system that haven't been inclusive, that haven't been informed of their needs, even when they've been well-meaning and not actively discriminatory. Just having a GP that doesn't know about intersex variation, that doesn't have the language and the tools to talk about gender identity. We know that a lot of discrimination faced by LGBTIQ+ people is actually accidental, and it comes from a place of not having that solid knowledge, foundation of knowledge. Youth not being comfortable, access to timely policy and organisational barriers, that's a really great one. Sometimes when we think of discrimination faced by LGBTIQ+ young people, we go straight to the interpersonal stuff, but sometimes it can be before they've even gotten in the door. Thinking if you're gender non-binary and you're filling in an intake form and the options are male or female. Thinking if it says what's your mum's name, what's your dad's name, and you've got two mums, and it's not what's your parents' name. All those different ways that we're signalling, actually, this is not a space for you, and this is not a space that you can talk about your experiences in. Great, lots of things here. I'll be able to share all this as well, Mason and Matthew, so if anybody's interested after the session. Concern about being out, it is a really big one. Definitely thinking in regional contexts, and that idea about how that information can be gotten around, and sometimes there's really severe safety and well-being concerns for being out in a regional area. But even within Perth, thinking about how interwoven different individuals are in Perth, and maybe family finding out or friends finding out. Lots of barriers there. Great. Any questions about the barriers? No, I'll move on. Sorry, I don't have my chat function up, so I can't see if anything's in there. Just yell it out, Mason or Matthew, if there's anything in the chat that you want to bring up.
Susan did raise an interesting question around the concept of coming in, which she hadn't encountered before, and would love to hear a little bit more about that.
It's probably not something that I feel too comfortable talking in depth about, other than just that definition, because it's not something that I have had personal experience with. But what I can do is I can send, I'm just making a note for myself, I can send around some video content that explains people in their own words that idea of calling in or coming in instead of coming out. But to give you a bit more definition, it's really the idea of maybe only specific people knowing somebody's sexuality and gender identity. Sometimes it's around, especially family, knowing that young person has that sexuality or gender identity, but not talking about it. It's not something that's acknowledged and out in the open, even though everybody might understand that that's what that is for that person. So yeah, it's a pretty complex thing, and I wouldn't want to do it injustice by saying the wrong thing. So I'll leave it at that and share a resource if I can.
We will happily share any resources that are mentioned or any further information following the session in the minutes, including references to other reports and guides for practice.
Cool. Thank you for bringing that up, though, because it does make me realise something that we should have spoken about in the coming out section. Thinking about your practice in working with young people is not assuming that when a young person is out to you, that means they're out to everyone, that they might not be out in their school or workplace. They might be out with one parent, but not the other parent. They might be out with this sibling, but not that auntie. They might be out with this service provider, but not that service provider. So really just being mindful in having very clear discussions with young people about how and when they want their identity and experiences spoken about. So going back to barriers, also want to think about internal barriers that LGBTIQ plus young people might have. And that goes back to that internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and intersexism. And unfortunately, when a young person realizes an identity, they don't get a magical Harry Potter owl come and deliver them this wonderful tome that is everything you need to know about LGBTIQ plus cultural competency. And we're not very good at actually providing education to the LGBTIQ plus community about the LGBTIQ plus community. So young people, even if they are incredibly out, incredibly comfortable with their identities, might still hold a lot of misinformation about identities, particularly ones that they don't have in that acronym. Young people might be exploring and questioning. So that can be a barrier to accessing services because they might not feel like that their identities or experiences are valid, especially if they're shifting over time. It gets expecting that discrimination, as we brought up before. They might not have capacity to disclose, and definitely that fear of consequence once they get that information out there. Anything before we move on to thinking about COVID?
So Arby's put in an interesting point in the chat. saying, interestingly, some organizational barriers may include entering into or not into the political space where LGBTQ plus themes intersect with political party agendas.
Right, yeah. So if I'm hearing that correctly, a barrier being that a certain LGBTIQ plus group might be affiliated with a political space or a cause activism space that LGBTIQ plus individual doesn't identify with. Is that correct?
Arby, feel free to speak out on chat or on the microphone.
Yeah, hi Bella. Arby here from the City of Kwinana. I guess I refer probably specifically to local governments. Some may have the same sort of policy, but then there needs to be some clarification if there is issues that relate to LGBT plus themes. And, you know, I guess same-sex marriage was probably a big one for us in the past, where the local government couldn't be seen to be supporting one side of the argument or the other, or that's what I guess the organisation, that was their stance. So it made it very difficult to champion or be open or on that particular, I guess, theme, we couldn't be seen to supporting or not support, if that makes sense, because it was in the political arena. And I guess that those kinds of things become something that's very challenging amongst all of the other work that we're trying to do to understand what is and what isn't, and how do we really try to champion being inclusive.
Thank you for that, Arby, and thank you. I obviously grossly misinterpreted what you're saying, so I'm glad you were able to clarify. And yeah, it is a really important perspective. I hear quite a lot of things in what you said there. One being that we saw a lot of that happen during the marriage equality debate, and often that happens when we put LGBTIQ plus rights as a sort of tack them on as an added on optional extra, as opposed to seeing them through the lens of human rights and as a human right. And definitely there were multiple situations like that, particularly with something, so using your example of local councils not coming out and taking a stance, and the messages that sent to particularly young people in the area saying, well, this area doesn't support me, this area isn't going to stand by me, and by extension, perhaps this area or region isn't a place that's safe for me to be LGBTIQ plus without that visible kind of support from our systems and structures. Yeah. All right, so shall we move on to talking about some of the unique impacts that we've seen for LGBTIQ plus young people during COVID-19, and particularly those periods of isolation. And I can tell you as an organisation and an individual, we've seen a marked increase in the need for people seeking support around thoughts of suicide and their mental health. So thinking about it from the perspective of isolation, we saw that people were having reduced access to peer spaces, to LGBTIQ plus community. And this is particularly significant when you're thinking about an LGBTIQ plus cohort of people, because other types of peers are likely to have someone else in their family or in their home that has the same or similar kind of experience to them. So to use the example that if I was Burmese and from Burma and I was living with my family, it's likely that other people in my family are Burmese, speak the same language, understand what that means for me to be Burmese. But for LGBTIQ plus people, they might not have that peer or somebody with lived experience in their family So that disconnection during COVID isolation meant that there wasn't spaces where they can feel validated, where they could feel understood and speak with people that have had similar experiences in their life to them. We saw a lot of young people that were in isolation and lockdown with non-supportive family. And that could range to anything from people who didn't agree with how people live their lives, with their identities, with the way that they describe themselves, the way that they present their gender, or the relationships that they have, all the way to really actually actively stopping young people from being able to express their sexuality or gender diversity. And that can be with family, but also with housemates. Young people might be living in a house where they may or may not be out, and where some of the housemates might not have actually been supportive of their identities. And then all of a sudden being locked down into a pressure cooker, having to face discrimination and negative comments without reprieve. So really that sort of intense environment with the disconnection from peer spaces as well. Due to financial stress, some people had to move back in with their families who might not be supportive, who might not be supportive of their partners. And there's sort of like this kind of uneasy agreement that this is how your life is, but we don't talk about it, but we meet each other for brunch on Sunday. And that's kind of manageable maybe for the young person, but then once they've had to move into the family environment again and be in that period of lockdown, really hearing all those negative messages about themselves and their identities has been extremely hard and harmful. Also, particularly for young people, access to LGBTIQ+ online spaces might have been restricted or prohibited or monitored in a way that it hadn't previously if that young person was accessing those online spaces outside of the home. But then all of a sudden, that's kind of under a bit of a microscope with parents, guardians, being able to monitor the places that that young person is actually accessing online. And we know as a general community that we've seen a marked increase in family and domestic violence and intimate partner violence, but also even more so within LGBTIQ+ contexts. Often family and domestic violence and intimate partner violence in LGBTIQ+ spaces is something that is supported by informal peer spaces. And that's because a lot of our supports and services for family and domestic violence are not culturally competent or set up operationally to support LGBTIQ+ people. So we saw a lot of that. So we're starting to think about, I guess, what is going to be the impact for young people looking at these things, facing these things within isolation as we're beginning to open up and offer more face-to-face services and engage with young people again. In terms of connection to services, there was reduced access to peer spaces that are informed for LGBTIQ+ young people. So to use the example of QLife, they weren't able to transition to at-home supports in the way that some of the other services were, so the hours were cut. So it was only 6 p.m. till 10 p.m. That you were allowed to be LGBTIQ+ person seeking support. And just sort of thinking about the difficulty in that a lot of then that support has fallen to informal places. So we have a cohort of LGBTIQ+ young people who might have been traumatized, lack access to spaces, going through the general things that they were going through before COVID happened, being the peer supporters for other people that are also going through the same thing. So it's kind of this whole system of people who seeking supports don't have the places in order to seek them. So the young people supporting each other, which is great if we're looking for a peer context, but not great when we're talking about each party in that arrangement being traumatized and re-traumatized by each other and not having capacity, not having resources, not having training, knowledge and skills to be able to support. We know that there is a great fear of accessing new services. So even though there was wonderful things that came out of COVID, all of a sudden telehealth, which we were told that could never happen, it's too difficult, things like that were starting to activate. But for a lot of LGBTIQ plus people, it's not as simple as just speak to anyone, because it really is knowing that that person is going to have the knowledge to be able to understand your support needs, and that it isn't a space that you're going to be discriminated against. So thinking of a telehealth where it might be a phone call and the individual helping you might assume your gender based on your voice, and already that's sort of a disengagement there, which means that's not going to be a supportive space for you. And also a lot of mental health and health messaging during COVID was providing support options that weren't actually appropriate for LGBTIQ plus people, and there often weren't specific LGBTIQ plus resources that were handed out. And it really did highlight the gaps that we already know exist in our services. And don't get me wrong, we work with a lot of organisations, and a lot of mental health crisis and health services are really doing their best to upskill around inclusive practice. But you're only as good as your least informed staff member. And so if LGBTIQ plus people are engaging with an organisation that are wonderful, they've got rainbow tick, but somebody assumes their gender or doesn't know what they're talking about, or makes an assumption about what the gender their partner is, all that work and policies and procedures doesn't mean anything in terms of to that individual that's engaged with that service, and how likely they're going to be to access other mainstream services once they've had that experience. Any questions?
Just raising my own question, Bella. So one thing we heard from a few services over the last few months was that even when some young people were engaging in telehealth and did have access to non-face-to-face counselling or engagement options, the quality of that engagement was actually much lower because of fear of family overhearing, meaning they couldn't directly or explicitly address topics such as being LGBTQI+, or let alone further mental health stigma, and admitting to family that they might be experiencing mental health difficulties. Do you think that that's potentially going to have some long-term impacts for young people, or will that somewhat resolve as they're able to re-engage with services reopening physically?
Yes and no. And probably because for some individuals that is kind of damaging to the point of putting that young person back into the position of feeling like their identity is something to be kept secret, something to be shameful of, something that they can't speak openly about. And once you've kind of felt that in spaces that are supposed to be safe for you, it can be harder to open up again in another space, even if that is a safe space. So it definitely has the potential to have that longer lasting effect when we think about that young person engaging with another service, if that is face-to-face, where they can feel like that they can openly talk about those things. So thinking about health and wellbeing, we're remembering those higher existing rates of thoughts of suicide and mental health. So LGBTIQ plus young people came into the situation of COVID already on the back foot in terms of their capacity to be able to cope with extra pressures that came with the pandemic. Gender affirming surgery was put on hold, and for some people that might have been a long time in coming, and we saw a lot of folks that have been waiting for gender affirmation surgeries really sort of feeling like that they're stuck, and that having a lot of negative impact on how they see themselves and feel about themselves. We saw a lot of young people really struggling to access hormones or blockers or other kind of affirming treatments. And also complications with COVID and things like chest binding, because it's restricting the chest and with COVID's effects on respiration and the lungs. So there was lots of kinds of those things that LGBTIQ plus young people might use daily, that all of a sudden access to those was very difficult, and sometimes they couldn't access them at all. And a lot of those things were part of how LGBTIQ plus young people kept themselves mentally healthy and well, because there are ways in which they could affirm themselves. So really the mental health impacts of that were quite severe. Lack of access to sexual health support was difficult during this time and limited. Youth educating peers, YEP did some great work in getting information out there to young people about how they could really engage with sexual health supports, but we know that that was something that was quite difficult for LGBTIQ plus young people at that time, knowing that, again, it's not a situation of maybe just going to any doctor or maybe just going to any sexual health clinic, that people were really needing those peer spaces in order to have their needs met. There was also a lot of discussion around HIV and immunosuppression and COVID. So that caused up a lot of anxiety for people who might have actually had misinformation and limited access to medications that they needed for their health, and also to the mental health supports around that. There is a resource on that, which is one of the things that I'll be handing out at the end, which you might find helpful. And a resource on chest binding during COVID as well. So I'll hand that out. That might be something useful for some young people you're supporting. So societal impacts. There really has been residual effects of the plebiscite that are still kind of ricocheting around the community. And something that's played into that quite a lot is we saw what we see anytime there's a big natural disaster or there's some kind of worldwide incident. We see multiple incidents of public blaming of COVID on LGBTIQ plus community, and that might come from religious leaders, it might come from international politicians, but it's just another way that I guess society is sending a message to LGBTIQ plus people that there's something to be feared or othered. And what we saw with this is it particularly tying in with the HIV and AIDS epidemic, because we're having a lot of discussion around pandemics, epidemics, sort of whole public health kind of situations that we don't usually sort of talk about those things unless you particularly work in public health. And that tied in with a lot of that stigma and shame around HIV and AIDS and the fear of that. There were no specific LGBTIQ plus targeted messages, and we know that often, unless messages are explicitly targeted to LGBTIQ plus people, they will switch off because they're thinking, well, this isn't me, this doesn't include me, or this doesn't include my needs. So that was a really big impact on the community being able to access information. And we know that there's a high population of LGBTIQ plus young people who experience homelessness. The stats around that are really iffy, again, because we don't collect data, and if people aren't turning up at shelters because the shelters aren't appropriate for them, we don't know that they're homeless in the first place. Also because of how homelessness presents itself within youth and LGBTIQ plus community, it's often those unseen types of homelessness, of couch surfing, of engaging in a relationship with a partner that you're not actually interested in because it gives you somewhere to stay. Also a lot of services that were targeted at supporting people experiencing homelessness during COVID were faith-based services, or services that didn't actually have capacity to be able to engage with LGBTIQ plus young people in a manner that they would be responsive to. So lots of barriers there. I also just wanted to bring up sex workers, because there's a high proportion of sex workers that identify as LGBTIQ+. And we know that as a community, sex workers were incredibly impacted by COVID in terms of their ability to provide for themselves and the other kind of aspects of their life that intersected and made them more vulnerable to COVID, but also to the economic and societal changes that were happening at that time in not being able to access supports. Any questions before I move on? No, Mason's having a look, but he'll give a yell out if something comes up.
If anybody does want to speak out rather than put it in chat, please do feel free. I don't mean to dominate these question spaces.
Not just a question, even a comment, and anything else that something else you've seen in your community or with young people that you're supporting, get it out there.
I mean, I'll reiterate a point I made just earlier this week at the Ministerial Roundtable on Youth, talking about recovery, which is that I think some of the kind of societal impacts of COVID-19 is that for many young people, this is the latest in a series of natural disasters and high profile, quite traumatizing and highly publicized war events. And there's a bit of a profound sense of hopelessness amongst many young people, especially in terms of global stability and a future for young people. For LGBTIQ plus young people, and I've heard this through some of my work engaging with specific young people, there's an increasing fear that a society is not being built for them and a future is not being built for them, and that COVID, with its isolation and reduced access to services, has really kind of compounded upon that feeling of hopelessness. Less of a question, more of a comment, and something that I think we all need to be working to build up hope for the future amongst all young people, but particularly for LGBTI young people. This world is safe, this world will be safe. And there's been a comment from Shona McKay saying that the LGBTQ plus drop-in space online, Our Place, has been very well received by their young people, which is wonderful to hear.
Yes, I know. I'm mindful that I'm sort of like sounding all doom and gloom, because there has been amazing innovation that's happened in the space because we've had to innovate. So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you for your point too, Mason. I think that's a really important point. And if I could add a little bit further to that, is also the idea of what we've seen both in this country but other countries is this as an opportunity for certain political systems to be able to introduce measures that could impact on freedom. And that's very, very tightly tied within the LGBTIQ plus community, even if it isn't LGBTIQ plus specific. Thinking about anything like surveillance or the COVID app, if you did a survey on the amount of LGBTIQ plus people that downloaded the COVID app, I would hazard a guess that those numbers are extremely low, because as a community that has experienced surveillance and experienced the notion of being identified by your sex and sexuality and that being punishable is still something that's tightly held by the community, even youth who haven't necessarily experienced that particular part of history. So a lot of it stirred up a lot of that mistrust of where are we going, especially looking at other countries that in the midst of this pandemic are reducing LGBTIQ plus rights. So that sort of instability does come into the mind of LGBTIQ plus young people going, well, what is this new world going to look like? And I'd like to think just the visibility of having an event like this sends a bucket of hope to LGBTIQ plus young people, saying somebody understands that my needs are on the table here, that someone's talking about, hang on, what am I going to need as we move into the next few months and the next year and the next decade.
Charlotte's also just raised a really interesting point in the chat that her conversations with Q Life indicated that a lot of young people were using their time in isolation to explore their sexuality and gender.
100%. And it's when we're sort of coming to this at the moment where we'll go through looking at what are these ways that we're going to need to respond as youth supporters. That is one of them. For some LGBTIQ plus young people, it might not have been a negative space if they've been isolated in a supportive space with people that support them. It has been an opportunity to explore gender identity or sexuality. And for some people, even if it's not that exploring, it's just been a nice little bubble of safety, where if they don't experience harassment or discrimination or have to constantly defend their relationships or identity as they do the second they step outside their home, if they've been in that supportive space, then what we're finding now is the actual lockdown has been a really safe, supportive, nice little blanket fort of comfort, but the fear's coming now for those folks. Thinking, well, going back to school, I was bullied every day at school. I don't want to go back to school. Going back to work, what does that look like? Maybe I've solidified how I feel about my identity, and I can't not be out at work or at school or at other places in public anymore. And then that anxiety of what does that mean? How do I navigate that? So it's kind of either, I think LGBTIQ plus people have had really negative impacts of isolation during COVID, or they've had this wonderful experience and those sort of things are starting to filter out now. So what will we need to do to be ready to respond? Again, thinking about that transitioning back to education and work, how we support young people to do that. And picking up on what Mason said before, in how do we support people to do that, thinking that it might be coming from a place of hopelessness if they're thinking about finding work or re-engaging with the education system. Also that people's presentation or gender might have changed during the time of lockdown, as Charlotte said, in exploring that gender. So how do they reintegrate where they are now with the spaces that they're in outside of their home? Homelessness, that we're potentially looking at more LGBTIQ plus people experiencing homelessness, some of that due to financial pressures that have come with COVID, some of that due to maybe the discrimination that they faced in lockdown, and so them self-selecting out of the home or being asked to leave the home. Pickies has a great resource and is a great resource on that. So that's one of the things that I'll share with you at the end as well, if that's helpful. Employment and financial stress, obviously most members of our community have been impacted financially by what's happened. But thinking specifically about LGBTIQ plus young people and how they're often faced with discrimination at work, particularly transgender and gender diverse folks. So how we can support those young people to be able to find workplaces that are safe for them. Thinking about the stats that we spoke about post-COVID and then some of the experiences of LGBTIQ plus community during COVID, we're going to be ready to respond to the presence of suicide and to mental health needs, particularly anxiety. Folks with obsessive compulsive disorder really struggled during COVID, playing into those existing fears that they had, and also depression. So really having those solid skills to be able to proactively have those discussions about young people, even if you're not seeing anything that would cause you to worry, opening up the doors for those conversations and knowing that some of these things might start to filter through, because if they've had this nice safe space where anxiety has been the bane of their lifetime, and being out in the world has been the scariest thing. And actually it's been safe and warm and nice and comforting not to have to attend social things. Some of that stuff might start to come in the coming months. Thinking about sexual health needs that haven't been attended to in lockdown, and physical health needs, particularly those that are connected to gender affirmation. And with the sexual health needs, also thinking about the supports that young people might need about how to re-engage with relationships, with connecting with other people after this period of isolation, and how to navigate existing relationships if they've been isolated from partners, and so how to kind of navigate that. And also family and domestic violence and intimate partner violence, having that knowledge of being able to start those conversations, because we know that often LGBTIQ plus young people really struggle to identify that they're even experiencing family and domestic violence. And some of that's due to the ways that we talk about family and domestic violence. We talk about it in a very gendered way, as a man being a perpetrator and a woman being a victim. And also there's kind of misinformation around two people of a same gender, of it being a fair fight. So it can't be viewed as family and domestic violence. So really being up on those myths and stereotypes and being able to challenge those with young people, if what they've experienced in lockdown with a partner or with family or with housemates is an unsafe situation, helping them navigate that. Any questions at the moment? No? Getting sick of the sound of my voice? So as we move on to connecting, we're also thinking about one of probably the biggest things that we can do is be really across what is out there in our geographical spaces, but also in online spaces, because definitely for rural and regional areas, a lot of the support for LGBTIQ plus people is only online. Building links with those groups and services, really understanding who they are and what they do and who they're useful for. And also remembering that not everybody wants a peer space. So I think it's really important for youth workers to have a sophisticated understanding of the types of LGBTIQ plus peer spaces that they can connect young people into, but also providing spaces that aren't peer spaces, because sometimes a peer is the only person that an LGBTIQ plus person wants to talk to, and sometimes it's the last person that they want to talk to, because it might not feel safe for them if it's a small community, if it's a regional space, if they've had existing relationships with people that are part of those groups or organisations or events. So just being mindful of that when we're thinking about who we can connect young folks in with. So we did bring up Q Life. So hopefully you all have heard of Q Life, but if you haven't, it's a service that's staffed by LGBTIQ plus peers, and it's telephone and web chat. It's not just a crisis service, so it can be a space where young people can call to just talk about anything that might be connected to their sex, sexuality or gender identity, or it might not be. They just want a peer to talk to about something else that isn't about their identity. There is a referral database that has everything from doctors, mental health practitioners, emergency supports, hair removalists, sports groups, hairdressers, everyone in between. I don't know why I'm saying lots of hair things. I must need a haircut or something. But everyone in between, they're services that are known to be inclusive, that have had training, and that are supported by peer reviews and peer experience. The community knows that this is a safe place for those individuals to go to. It's really important with referrals as well, coming back to that big umbrella of alphabet soup, is some referrals are totally safe and informed for a lesbian, but not for a trans person. Some services might be absolutely great with gay men, but if you're a trans woman, it's not the right service for you. So really drilling down into what services are, not just going, it's got a rainbow on it, it's for everyone. And also thinking about those other intersectional identities. And unfortunately, it's really tricky to find spaces that can actually be competent to support multiple aspects of identity. So having those conversations about, well, is it more important to have an LGBTIQ plus peer support for you, or is it more important to have a space that is really informed about the needs of people who are not neurotypical and supporting folks with disability? So just sort of pulling that stuff apart. Here are just some of many, and these are just random ones that I grabbed that exist. You might know of some of these, you might not. Trans folk of WA have all kinds of support groups, meetup groups. They have specific groups around suicide prevention. They have groups for young people, for parents of young people or carers of young people. They do online events and I'm sure in-person events when that's happening again. Bisexual plus community is for anybody that identifies under that bisexual, pansexual umbrella. They've been doing lots of virtual meetups, like a cuppa and a chat and virtual book club and things like that. P-flag, I put that there, that's parents and friends of lesbians and gays, because when we're thinking about supporting an LGBTIQ plus young person, we're often thinking about the other players in their life, whether it be their family, their loved ones, their housemates, their school, and the education and support that they might need to wrap around that young person. Grey is GLBTI rights in ageing. And I know you might be thinking, well, that's not very specific for young people, but the young person might have LGBTIQ plus parents, grandparents in their life, that could be a service that is helpful for them. The Freedom Centre is a youth-specific service drop-in. They also, so Freedom Centre also is part of YACWA and also has inclusive education. So if you're really doing advocacy and support for young people in their educational setting, it's not up there, but inclusive education is your first port of call to really being able to get them to do some of that supporting in educational settings. And for those of you in the Southwest, Inclusive Education are running a youth retreat in early December. And that's a funded youth retreat for young folks to be able to attend and really connect with peers and do some kind of mental health and wellbeing support stuff. So just contact Miriam from Inclusive Education. We've got Rainbow Connection, which is a First Nations LGBTIQ plus radio show out in Perth, which can be a great space to try and find out of different groups that you might connect young people in with. And because of the lack of formal supports and services, often these kind of community groups actually do a lot of mental health and wellbeing support for LGBTIQ plus young people. So that's why I've put things there like Perth Gamers, who, I was about to say do video games. That shows how old I am, isn't it? They play the Atari, they do it in a Nintendo 64. I don't know what they do. It's something about Discord, I'm not sure. But that's a space for LGBTIQ plus young people who really enjoy gaming, and that's online and things like board games as well. And Team Perth has all kinds of sports that are safe and inclusive spaces for young people to be able to engage with sports teams and really get that connection that sport provides. In terms of thinking of our regional spaces and acknowledging that there are a lot of supports that are provided by LGBTIQ plus groups in the region. One of the documents that I'll hand out has a list of some of the groups in those areas. That might be that first port of call in knowing if there's other activities or individuals or events that you can connect young folks in with. Any questions at the moment? Let's have a look and see if we've got any on here. Oh, this is a tricky question. I don't know if there is one thing you can do to be inclusive, but I would probably say one of the main things you can do is around language, is really practicing inclusive language as much as you can and non-gendered language as much as you can. So I'm talking here about pronouns specifically. There's an amazing tool on -18. It's a pronoun practicing tool. So if you find using gender neutral pronouns like they, them and theirs difficult, if it's something that doesn't really seem natural to you or you're not used to doing it, I really recommend using that pronoun tool. And I encourage you when you use it to actually say it out loud so you develop that muscle memory. Don't just sit there and type in the pronouns, but just get used to saying that. And definitely know that you use gender neutral pronouns more than you realise. It's something that we use every day. So if Mason was to say to me, oh, after this session, I'm going to pick up my cousin from the airport, I'd say, oh, what time are they coming in? And I say they because I don't know that person's gender. And if we as service providers and supporters of young people can really get used to not assuming someone's gender, using ungendered language as much as we can, it really sends a message to them that despite all those barriers, this is a safe space for you, and it makes it more likely that they're going to engage in help seeking and disclose details of their life that will help you understand what are their specific health and wellbeing needs, because they're likely to be more honest with you about other facets of their life if you're signalling that that's a safe space. Oh, there we go. Well, we just answered the second question. But the latter part of that question is how can I use them? And one of the best ways that we can start conversations about pronouns is by actually disclosing our own pronouns. So whether that be something like this, putting it in your name on a Zoom call, having it on your email signature, in a meeting, in person or whatever, just saying what your pronouns are, and just simply asking what someone's pronouns are can be the easiest way. It can seem a little bit uncomfortable at first. It can seem like a strange thing to do, but for us as as service providers, being uncomfortable slightly for a minute to ask that question is much less work than that young person spending all this time ascertaining, well, actually, is this person going to misgender me? Are they going to understand my identity? Is this a safe space for me to seek support? So we do the heavy lifting there, even if it feels clunky or uncomfortable. What do you think will be the biggest need for young rainbow people in the next year? I'm going to open this up to the group and see what ideas you all might have based on what you've heard or just on your observations and your own knowledge and experience. No one? Go, Person.
I'll go. I was trying to allow a space for somebody else. I'm very aware that I've spoken a lot today. Again, I think one of the biggest needs in the next year will probably be, as I mentioned earlier, building hope for young people. I'm particularly concerned around kind of the dominant political discourse around LGBTI young people, as well as kind of an ongoing debate on the validity of their identities. The marriage equality plebiscite was very recent, as we've mentioned, as well as the recent calls for an inquiry into the coverage and treatment of trans and gender diverse young people, which thankfully was shut down pretty quickly. But I'm concerned that post-COVID, again, we've kind of compounded that feeling of hopelessness and not feeling as though there is a space for them in society at large, as a result of some of the messaging that's put out by our media, as well as things like climate change that are continuing not to be addressed with the urgency they need. Also, Charlotte has put in a fantastic comment in the chat, which is protection from the religious discrimination bill, which is huge. And Charlotte, if you want to speak to that, I very much invite you to do so, as it's a huge, huge topic, and one that the YPN, the Youth Pride Network, is very focused on.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add, just that hopefully the one good thing that will come out of COVID is that bill losing momentum. And I think then if that does get passed, then the momentum will be, this sort of work is going to be even more important, in the sense that young people will be more conscious that they can't take inclusion and acceptance for granted. And so this kind of signalling work is going to be super, super important for youth organisations.
Thank you, Mason and Charlotte. Yeah, 100%. In hearing what you were saying, Mason, around that sort of hope building. So how do you as youth workers and us as service providers, how do we do that work around visibility of LGBTIQ plus people, young people, and how do we do that work around validity, and definitely tying in with what you were saying, and also what Charlotte was saying around the religious discrimination bill, thinking about that public discussion, that LGBTIQ plus young people's bodies, relationships, lives and experiences are up for public discussion, and how exhausting that is, which is why there's still that residual effect from the plebiscite. So re-engaging with this second debate around religious discrimination, really was the community is starting from a point of already being depleted in being able to self-advocate. And so I would probably say the biggest need from my perspective to link in with that is the need for allyship, and it's for allies to do the heavy lifting, because the community is exhausted. And young people are exhausted when you put the other filters onto that. So thinking about Black Lives Matter now, thinking about the environment and climate, thinking about the economy and jobs, and thinking about world security and what does the future look like. Young LGBTIQ plus people need allies to do the heavy lifting, to be informed, to challenge discrimination and homophobia and transphobia and biphobia, when they hear it, when they see it, when they say it, when they feel it. And it's, I don't have the study at hand, but a recent study that was conducted around allyship showed there's actually been a marked decrease in LGBTIQ plus allyship. And I think the active allyship, and I think that's because there's so many other things that have come to hand. So again, LGBTIQ plus needs sort of get tacked on as this optional extra that we'll get to if we have the time. And the one thing that I say to kind of help people reframe LGBTIQ plus needs firmly in the center of people's minds is, it's, except for disability, it's one of the only identities that exists across every single other identity. There's LGBTIQ plus people of all cultures living in all places, in rural and regional, in metro, who have a disability, who speak all languages, who are 10 foot tall, who are 2 foot tall, who are like, so it sits across every other kind of demographic section of community, who are older, who are younger. So it really does need to be prioritised in a way that it hasn't been. Yeah, does anybody else have any ideas about what they think the biggest need will be emerging? Everyone's so quiet. I was worried that there was not going to be enough time, but maybe you're just absorbing everything. I might then just add another thing around allyship, because probably one of the most common attitudes or comments that we'll encounter when we do LGBTI workshops is, well, kind of, marriage equality has happened, isn't everything fine now? And really, what multiple studies have shown that actually since marriage equality, the discrimination against LGBTIQ plus people has increased, because as there's action, there's reaction. And that's what happens when societies change. So it's really important for us to keep pushing forward in knowing that that was a great piece of work that was done to address systemic discrimination. But it's one tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle of work that still has to be done.
Bella, I have a question on that actually, and apologies if this thought is half formed, but as we're engaging with young people and talking about the topic of kind of discrimination and the current climate and environment for LGBTI plus young people, how do we acknowledge some of that reaction and pushback and frame it as hope for the future? Because I imagine it might be quite dismissive for a young person if they're your client, you're their youth worker, and you're saying, well, things are getting better, I promise you this, they are getting better, when that young person is seeing messages that are entirely to the contrary and really impacting their mental health. How do we frame that?
The simple answer is to acknowledge it honestly. And it's the same when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about thoughts of suicide. We want to kind of put a nice glossy coating on things in order to make people feel better, but we actually know what makes people feel better is giving them the space to talk about the terrible things, to talk about the horrible things, and to talk about the hard things. So just that acknowledgement of the fact that there are still difficulties faced by the LGBTIQ plus community, but also specifically by that person. Because we talk about equality and change in our community like it's cultural change, and it's often not, because one family could be really supportive and the house next door could be not supportive at all. And so all the marriage equality in the world doesn't change the experience of the young person sitting in this house. So just, I think acknowledging that simply is probably one of the most powerful things that you can do. Can you pull out aspects of positivity? I would say, why not? In terms of thinking about the call to action, that acknowledging the work that has to be done, so acknowledging the religious discrimination bill, that allies did step up during the marriage equality debate. So that can give us hope that allies will step up in the religious discrimination bill, or when there's this thing, or when there's this next thing. We have a question here. How do I ask a young person if they want me to change the way I interact or refer to them, especially if there are signaled changes post-isolation? I'm not quite sure how to interpret the last sentence. So I will just speak to the first part, and if whoever asked feels comfortable to clarify in chat or jump on and have a talk, do so. Otherwise I will bumble through best I can. In terms of asking a young person, it really is straight up just asking them, and a way to make that more comfortable can be doing those signaling things around your own pronouns, but it can also just be part of, I assume that most of you will have kind of a general touchstone process when you're engaging with a young person. Okay, I haven't seen you for X amount of weeks, let's catch up on what's happening. It's about making it part of your daily practices. So saying, right, so last time we met, you said this, you said that, we're talking about X issue and thinking about what we can do on that. You had said that you were in a relationship with this person and that you're seeing your gender like this and these are the pronouns we're using. Has anything changed with that? So really just threading it through that general kind of check-in, remembering that especially with young people and identity, things might have changed since you last saw them. So finding those ways to kind of weave it into our practices. Signal changes. Oh, so, okay, maybe this is meaning maybe that young person's wearing pride pins. And yeah, or they're expressing their gender differently, they're dressing differently, their hair's different, maybe they're wearing makeup, maybe they're not. Yeah, just acknowledging it, but and using that as a discussion point. Wearing a pride pin yourself can be one way that you can also open up those conversations. In thinking about how to generally open the door for discussion on LGBTIQ plus topics, one of the best ways that we see it being done is around having that discussion about confidentiality. So building it in there, saying, you know, what we talk about, we'll say confidential here, unless you tell me you're going to hurt yourself or someone else, and this is where we take that information. But if you tell me something around your sexuality or gender identity or whatever, that will stay here. So just sort of those nice ways you can build those type of really overt signalling, because often when we're first trying to do signalling, we do that sort of very vague thing of like, oh, you could just tell me anything, and we think that the young person knows, oh, okay, that means I can tell them that I think I'm asexual. That means that I can tell them I've started seeing a guy. That means that I can tell them X. But we have to be very explicit in making sure that it's about identity or about sexuality or about being LGBTI, if that makes sense. I hope that answered your question. Well, I think we're pretty much kind of wrapping up then. If there are other questions, filter them through in the next few minutes. But hopefully this gave you a bit of a snapshot in thinking about some of the ways that you can proactively change your practice immediately to better engage with LGBTIQ plus young people, but also start to think about what are the other skills, knowledge, resources that you're going to have at hand to introduce because of these impacts of COVID and how that might impact on that young person's mental health and well-being. I like to just put this up at the end because this is something that we often hear when we do this work around we treat everyone the same, and really acknowledging that we're not interested in equity of input, we're interested in equity of outcome. So thinking about what we need to do as service providers to give those extra boxes to young LGBTIQ plus people so they have the same outcome as people who don't need those same boxes, by the way in which we practice, the language that we use, the way we advocate for them, the referrals we provide, and the way that we change our processes and policies and procedures to overtly meet the support needs of young LGBTIQ plus people. If you are interested, next week we have both an LGBTIQ plus family and domestic violence workshop and just a general diversity and inclusive practice workshop. If that's something that you or your workplace or anyone you know is interested, either contact us or contact YACWA and they can get you in contact with us. And also skills around being able to have safe conversations about suicide. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and it's specific skills that you really need to learn in order to be able to support folks that are thinking about suicide. And it is incredibly important when we're thinking about those stats for the LGBTIQ plus community. We do have an online training, but we also do face-to-face trainings that are available. So if you're interested in that, let us know. And we also sell our nice little signalling pins and posters and all kinds of things. And the proceeds actually fund free LGBTIQ plus suicide prevention projects in the community. So let us know if that's something you're interested in. But basically, thank you for your participation. I understand that this kind of format can be difficult to be able to do that backwards and forwards and ask those questions. So I hope that the content was at least gave you some food for thought. And definitely just thank you to YACWA, because picking up on that thread of providing hope, as I said before, I think even just young people seeing that a session like this is going forward, I think has the capacity to build so much hope for young LGBTIQ plus people that are really saying, hey, the youth work sector values what I need and is really trying to meet us where our needs are. So thank you.